much cleaner than what we're going to hear tonight. I want to make it real. I want to focus on Jesus the man tonight. And you cannot separate Jesus the man and Jesus as God. But tonight you're going to hear more about Jesus the man. I want to do that because in this day and age, my fear is that there are a lot of people, even a lot of Christians, who look at Jesus and they go, yeah, I hear those stories, and he was a legend. He was a mythical person. No, not at all. He was a real person. And in today's world, my fear is he was a Marvel character, a superhero. And that's the way some people look at Jesus. And that's what I want to dispel tonight. The 30 last hours of Jesus really began on Thursday morning. It was the 13th day of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. We know that because it was later on that night, it was turning to the 14th. So in the Jewish calendar, in their days, the next day began at sundown. And so Jesus rose on Thursday, the 13th of Nisan, and he would die on the 14th of Nisan. He would celebrate the Last Supper on the 14th of Nisan because the next day began at night. I can pretty much tell you what time he got up that morning. You're going like, really? Yes, I can, because all good Jews rose with the rising of the sun. And even before the sun rose, they would wake up as it got light in the morning. That morning, it got light about 5:45. And I know that Jesus probably rose at that time because the workday began for Jews about 6 in the morning. I can even tell you what exact time the sun rose that morning. It was 6:11. So at 5:45, it would have been light. At 6:11, people already were working. The Jews would work typically from 6 in the morning until noontime, and then, especially that time of year, it would get really hot. And so they would take a break from noon until 3, and then they'd work again from 3 until 6 o'clock. What did Jesus do that morning? Well, after he rose, what do you do when you rise? What's the first thing you do? Go to the bathroom. Absolutely. And you think of Jesus peeing and maybe doing something else as well. And it's just, we don't talk about that. We don't picture Jesus as that kind of a person. Somehow, many of us probably thought he just didn't do those things, but he did. And so I'm telling you that when he rose that morning, he probably, went off to the bushes and did his thing. And so did the other apostles. The Jews were very hygienic. They knew that they had to keep their urine and feces away from where they lived. And so, in all probability, they would move off to the side. I tell you that not to degrade Jesus at all, but to begin this talk with the idea that Jesus was a man, truly a man. And being a man, he would do manly human things. He probably had some kind of breakfast, although the Jews did not really, most Jews did not eat a lot for breakfast, if they ate at all. If he did, he would have had a cup of herbal tea or herbal water, maybe a piece of bread, and at that time of year, possibly some fruit. Because in Jerusalem at that time, it was the end of the rainy season. The rainy season began in October and lasted until about the 1st of April. And beginning about the 1st of April, it got very hot and very arid, but everything was really plush and very green because the rainy season had just come to an end. As a matter of fact, I want you to imagine the smell of fresh fruit. Have you ever walked out in an apple orchard, with mushed apples on the ground, and you can smell it? I mean, it just overwhelms you. That's the kind of smell that Jesus and his apostles would have smelled at that time of year somewhere around Jerusalem. Jerusalem longitudinally is on the same longitude roughly as Macon, Georgia. So farther south than we live. So the temperature difference would have been significant at that time of year compared to where we live. Jesus probably spent the day with his mother. Now, he was staying in Bethany. Bethany was about 3 miles from Jerusalem. It was up beyond the Garden of Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives. I put this up here, not that you can see, you don't have to worry about the detail. I'm just going to refer to it a couple of times. But this is north, south, east, and west. So here is the Mount of Olives, and Bethany was just beyond that. So about 3 miles away from Jerusalem. He was at the home of Lazarus, Martha and Mary. And his mom was probably there that night. The apostles were there. Because we know Scripture tells us, and I will refer to Scripture repeatedly during this talk, but not specifics, more in general terms. In other words, I may not quote Scripture as often as you might like, because this is a story about this man, and Scripture, again, gives us a general view of who this man was. So here we are in Bethany. He probably spent the day talking to his mom. See, Jesus knew what was going to happen. The anxiety must have been building already. He probably also spent the day speaking with the apostles. See, Jesus had been with this group of 12 guys for about 2.5 years, to 3 years, somewhere in there, depending on who the apostles were. And he was their teacher. And he had been speaking to them about things that were going to happen, and they didn't get most of it. These guys were fishermen. They were what the Jews referred to as amei haretz, the stupid ones. Okay, the uneducated. Now we know that all the apostles had some degree of education, and some more than others. For instance, Matthew, the tax collector, probably had the most education of all the apostles. But the other one who had quite a bit of education, we think, was Judas, because he was the money keeper. And so he had to have at least a sense of banking and being able to read and so on. The apostles, as I said, were gathered there. Jesus asked 2 of them to leave Bethany and go into the city of Jerusalem. And he said, listen, you two, Peter and John, said, go into Jerusalem through the fountain gate. The fountain gate, another name for the fountain gate is Watergate. I'm sure one of the apostles was named Nixon. But here was the fountain gate on the southeast end of the city. Jesus said, go into the fountain gate, into the city of Jerusalem. This was the beginning of the feast of Passover, which would last 7 days. He said, when you go into the city through that gate, you're going to come upon a man who's carrying a water jug, and ask that man if the master could celebrate the Passover meal at his house that night. Sounds simple enough, right? Until you begin to break it down. At this time of year, the feast of the Passover, one of the holiest days of the year in the Jewish faith, there were a lot of visitors to the city. The city itself, if we talk about that for a second, was about 1.5 miles long and about 1/2 mile to 3/4 of a mile wide. So let's think about that for a second. Let's figure out what 1.5 miles is here in town. Let's start at Pitkins, okay? And go down Colby Street, and you go 1.5 miles, and it will get you to Walmart. Okay, so it's that length. That was the length of the city of Jerusalem. What's 1/2 mile? Is it from Colby to White Lake Drive? Is that 1/2 mile? More? So maybe 3/4 of a mile? So anyway, in your mind, you may have that idea that was the size of the city of Jerusalem, that area. The city was walled. And within that walled city, the walls were 40 feet high. They were made of limestone, huge blocks of limestone, 20 to 40 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. And the limestone had been cut from quarries around the city of Jerusalem. And thousands, or rather hundreds and literally 1,000 years before Jesus ever showed his face on earth. The city took a long time to be built. And so these walls were made of limestone 40 feet high, except for the parapets around the walled city. The parapets are like towers, and they served a variety of purposes. Certainly for defensive purposes, there could be lookouts to see if the enemy was coming. And there were other purposes as well. One of them was in one side, in the east, one of the parapets close to the Watergate, one of the 1,000 priests who worked in the temple would be assigned to look for the rising of the sun. And his job was to stand up in this tower and look and then announce as best he could, and people would ask down below, "Do you see the sun rise?" "Yes, the sun has risen above the Mount of Moab." And so the day had begun. That was his job. The brick, these walls also had rough pieces at the bottom of them. So limestone that didn't quite fit or cracked would just be pushed off to the side, so that if a charging army had come to overtake Jerusalem, they'd have to climb over these rough rocks, these boulders of limestone first. And it would be difficult to put down a ladder to try and climb up. It's a beautiful city. Inside, there were about 300 acres. If you take the walls away and so on, inside about 300 acres. And inside those 300 acres lived 100,000 people. So now, take Pitkins to Walmart, to White Lake Drive, and put 100,000 people there. Can you imagine how crowded that would be? And part of the city was the temple area. The temple area was 40 feet higher than the walls. So it must have looked absolutely stunning to any of these fishermen, these simple people, these amecharetz, who were coming, and they would look at these walls, these white walls, and see the 40 feet of of this magnificent temple. It was beautiful. It was intimidating because they were used to living in hovels, little homes that had 1 or 2 rooms and whose ceilings weren't very high because the average height of a man at that time was 5 feet 5. And we believe that Jesus may have been a touch more than that, something like 5'7". Historians simply are guessing at that. So here these 2 guys are. Let's go back to the story. These 2 guys are told by Jesus, now I want you to go into the city and I want you to find a guy carrying a water jug. There are 100,000 people in this area. It would be like me telling you, go to Grand Rapids and find a guy carrying a water jug, you know? I said there are 100,000 people in the city. Some estimates are lower than that, as low as 60,000, but it's still a lot of people for that small area. Except at the Feast of the Passover, on holy days like this, the population soared to 300,000 because people would come from miles around. It was law that any man who lived within a 15-mile area of the city of Jerusalem had to come and worship at the temple, had to celebrate the Passover at the temple. So it was, the population just burst. And there weren't any Holiday Inns in Jerusalem at the time. There may have been some inns, some places to stay, but most of those 300,000 people would be encamped on the hills around Jerusalem. And then they would come to the temple to worship. So again, here are these 2 guys. Go and find this guy carrying a water jug. Here's where Jesus, we see him as God. He knew. He told these 2 to go in, find this guy, and that's exactly what they did. Now, why is that a little unusual? Because at that time, in their culture, men didn't carry water jugs. That was a woman's job. And so when they entered and they saw a man carrying a water jug, they must have said, hey, okay, this must be our guy. It was their guy. And who was he? It was the father of the disciple Mark. Mark was a young man, probably 16, 17, 18 years old, probably the same age or very similar age to the apostle John. John was the youngest of the apostles. Jesus said, go and ask him, can the master celebrate the Passover meal at your home? The father of Mark was a pretty rich guy. So he lived in the southwest part of the city where the rich people lived. And amazingly enough, he lived about 300 feet from where the chief priest Caiaphas lived. As Jesus, later on, as the day wore on, he and the rest of the apostles, the 10, walked to Jerusalem, the 3 miles. How long does it take you to walk 3 miles? Maybe an hour, you know? Their pace may have been slow that day, maybe an hour and a half. So we think sometime around 5 o'clock or 5:30, Jesus and the apostles came toward Jerusalem. And I want you to just imagine them coming over the Mount of Olives with the 5:30 or the 6 o'clock sun. You know, here, even at this time of year, and we think that the comparable days on our calendar would have been about April the 6th at that time, in that year. That time of year, the sun shining at about 6 o'clock, you know, if you go out to the lake, you see beautiful sunsets. It's almost a yellow or a golden sun. And that's what Jesus would have seen as he crossed over the Mount of Olives. Came down the hillside, looked at this beautiful city The walls were white, as I said. As a matter of fact, I said there were 1,000 priests that worked the temple area. Those priests were assigned in the weeks before to wash the walls so that anyone visiting the city would truly be amazed. It was an incredible sight, especially if you're a poor man or a woman who has never seen anything like this gorgeous city and the height of the buildings compared to what your home is. Jesus would have come with his 10 apostles. The 2 were already at the house of Mark's father, which is called the cenaculum in Latin, cenaculum, or the cenacle. We get the word cenacle. The Latin word cenaculum simply means upper room. And so when you hear that term, they ate the Last Supper at the cenacle, that's what it means. I can tell you that Jesus would have come to this house, and I can tell you how he got upstairs. As I said, Mark's father was a rich man, so they did have a second story in the house. It was somewhat unusual in the crowded city for a lot of houses to have a second story, but the rich people on the southwest side of the city would have. Jesus would have walked up limestone steps on the outside of Mark's father's home, because the homes at that time did not have a lot of indoor steps like we have in our houses. He would have entered the room. There are different theories about what the room looked like. Some that the room was not that, didn't have that high of a ceiling. Again, most men were about 5'5". There were others, because this was a rich place that they were in, a rich home, says that there were stone columns and that the ceiling was much higher. But in any case, I can tell you what the layout of the room was that night. It was a table that was in the shape of a U. And at the closed end of the U would have been seated the guest of honor, or the master. That would have been Jesus. And the apostles would have reclined at table along the outside of this U. Scripture even tells us that Jesus reclined at table. You know, and I don't know if you've ever thought of that before, but that's what they did. You see, free men reclined at table when they ate. Slaves stood. So it was very symbolic to recline at table. I can even tell you what elbow Jesus reclined on that night. With certainty, it was his left. Because in Jewish custom, in Jewish culture, the left hand was considered the unclean hand. And why is that? Because it was the hand that they cleaned themselves with after they had done their daily duties. Now, obviously, I said that the Jews were very hygienic people, so the hands would have been cleaned, but nonetheless, it was just considered the unclean hand. The right hand would have been the hand that they ate with. As a matter of fact, the right hand would have been a friendly hand. Why don't you stand up? You're in a perfect place for me. Friends would have walked with their right hands held together. So we would be walking down the street and we'd be just not shaking hands, but just holding hands. Yeah. Well, if you saw a couple of guys walking down Colby Street holding hands, yeah. You know, you'd think it just looked odd. But in that culture, it was very common. The right hand was a clean hand. The right hand was a hand of friendship. So here they are reclining at table. They reclined on cushions that were 7 to 12 feet long called triclinia. These would have been sewn cushions and stuffed with straw or with leaves They may have been stuffed with some cloth, but cloth was expensive, so they wouldn't have wasted it on the inside, and they would have been fairly comfortable. But here they are, reclining at table and eating with their right hand. Did they ever use their left hand? Yes, but not for eating. They may move something over and so on. It's not like their left hand was never used at all. Here they are, seated around this table. Why a U shape? Because it allowed servants, let's make believe that this is a U, and the closed end is over where Ryan is. The servants would come in the middle and pour cups of wine or serve the food for the Passover meal. And the food was very tasty. We know that this was a very ritualistic meal. It was a meal that had been celebrated again and again, generation after generation, from the time of Moses. So you know the story. How many of you watched the Ten Commandments last Saturday night? Or if you've ever watched the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. We know the story that Moses was Hebrew, but he grew up as an Egyptian. His mother had placed him in a basket and sent him down the Nile, and one of the princesses of Egypt had found this child and raised the child as her own. And he became very powerful. As a matter of fact, Pharaoh loved him more than he loved his own son. And so there was a little jealousy that began taking place, and that was a problem. They found out at some point that Moses was Hebrew, and some people said he could be the deliverer of the slaves, the Israelites, who had been in captivity for 400 years, generation after generation after generation. So he was sent away. He was abandoned, said, go off into the desert and find your way. And they gave him 1 day's ration and 1 day's worth of water. Moses then encounters a family that takes him in, and he works with the family for a lengthy amount of time. And he sees God in the burning bush on the mountain. And we hear the story that Moses goes up. And if you watch the movie, this is what it sounds like. Moses, take off thy sandals from your feet, for you art standing on holy ground. Moses has a conversation with Yahweh, with God. And Moses says, God, haven't you heard the cries of the Israelites who are in captivity? How can you turn a deaf ear? And God says to Moses, I have heard the cry. So I'm going to send you to go set them free. Moses goes, the rest of the story, he encounters Pharaoh. He talks to Pharaoh and says, you got to let the Israelites go. And Pharaoh, by now, the father who loved Moses, Pharaoh, that father has died, and his son has taken his place. So the new Pharaoh is very jealous still of Moses. Moses said, you got to let people go. And Pharaoh said, no way. Moses, get out of here. And he says, what happens next? He sends 10 plagues over time. What were some of the plagues that were sent? Frogs, locusts, hail, the water of the Nile River that turned to blood. The sun was blocked out for 3 days, And the final one was the death of the first child, the firstborn. And it was Pharaoh who had actually said that first. He says, I'm tired of this. We've gone through 9 of these things. I'm going to end this. I'm going to have the firstborn child of all the Israelites killed. And it backfired. It turned on him. And God heard that and sent the angel of death. So here comes the reason why they celebrate the meal. They take a year-old calf, a lamb rather, and they kill it. And they take the blood and they put it on the lintel or the doorpost to show that the angel of death should pass over that house. And they ate this meal in haste because tomorrow they're leaving. They'd been there for 400 years. They had a lot of stuff. No garage sales. They were leaving in haste. And so the story of the Passover meal is celebrated again and again at this Passover dinner. Jesus would have started the dinner by standing up. Shema Yah Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Hebrew words which means, hear, O Israel, the Lord is God. The Lord is one. And thus began the meal. One of the first things that would have happened in the meal is the servants would have come with a pitcher that would have looked almost exactly like this and a bowl that would have looked like this. And they would have come and they would have washed the hands of everyone who was eating at this meal. Except for that night, Jesus did something different. What Jesus did, and Scripture tells us, he took a towel and he wrapped it around his waist. I'm going to throw it around my shoulder, actually. And he did this. He decided, I'm going to come, I'm going to wash your feet. Are you ready?
Sure.
And Jesus washed the feet of the apostles. Foot washing was a common thing. As a matter of fact, they would have a bowl at the door to actually put your feet in as you entered from the outside to wash off the dust. But it was a very menial thing. And Jesus was trying to teach the apostles the lesson. This is what you have to do for others. You have to humble yourself and serve others. You know, those who are in ministry are not the lofty people. I mean, we respect them, but they're servants. They're servants of all of you. That's what Jesus was saying that night. This is what you have to do for others. And if you remember Scripture, Peter says, wait a minute, Jesus, you're not going to wash my feet. No, I'm not going to let you do that. And Jesus said, Peter, if I don't do this, then you can't enter the kingdom with me. And Peter was like, okay. Then wash my feet and my hands, my face. Jesus said, no, this is enough. He taught the apostles even that night how they should act in the future. And so they celebrated this meal. Some of the things in the meal, we know that there was lamb. The Jews very rarely ate meat, so this was a big night. The lambs were slaughtered at the temple, and it's said that quite possibly 50,000 to 70,000 lambs were slaughtered at the temple over that period of time. It is now the 14th day of Nisan because the sun has gone down and a new day has begun as they begin this celebration. Sometimes when the clouds would come, the Passover meal was celebrated on the first night of a full moon in the month of Nisan. We celebrate Easter on the Sunday after the full moon. That's how we get Easter, and that's why Easter changes, because the full moon changes each year as well. They would have butchered this lamb, and they were to eat everything except the entrails. And so they consumed a lot of meat that night. They also had matzos, unleavened bread. And why? Because going back to the story of Moses that night, they ate unleavened bread because they didn't have time to put yeast in it and let it rise. So one of the jobs of the youngest child is to ask the father in the family ritualistic questions. Who is the youngest in this group of 12? John. John would have sat next to Jesus, probably on his right side. Who sat on the other side of Jesus? Who do you think? Peter. Yeah. John and Peter were really the two closest, John, Peter, and James, of the apostles to Jesus. John would have slid in. That wasn't his normal spot. Who typically would have been sitting next to Jesus on the right side? Judas. Judas. Judas was different. He was the money keeper. Think about this for a minute. The 11 other apostles were from Galilee. Galilee was about 40 to 50 miles north of Jerusalem. Judas was from Judea on the south side of Jerusalem. And Judea, the town that he came from, was about 40 miles away from Jerusalem. His name is Judas. Who do we call him? Judas Iscariot. So the Jewish form of that is not Iscariot. It is Judas Ishkarioth, which simply means Judas from the city of Kerioth. Kerioth was about 40 miles south of Jerusalem. He was the only Judean among the apostles. And so here he is. He's just sort of an outcast. He's the money keeper, which is an important job. But still, Judas didn't have many friends among the apostles. As a matter of fact, his closest friend probably was Jesus. Judas probably would have been sitting next to John. John would have slid in as the youngest child that night to ask the ritualistic questions next to Jesus, and then there would have been Judas. They ate lamb, they ate matzos, they ate moror, which is bitter herbs. And the child would have asked ritualistic questions. Father, why is this night different from all other nights? And the father would have explained, this is the night before we leave. We're eating in haste with our loins girt, which means our traveling clothes. We're wearing our traveling clothes as we eat. He would have said, Father, why do we eat bitter herbs? And the father would have explained, we eat bitter herbs to remind us of the bitterness of slavery. Father, why do we dip these herbs in salt water? We dip them in salt water to remind us of the tears of our ancestors. And so the night went on. They would have eaten something called beitza, which was an egg. An egg was a food of mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning, weeping, but it was also food of hope. That's why we have Easter eggs. They're signs of hope. And they would have had wine, 4 cups of wine. The 4 cups of wine had significance because they celebrated the things that God had promised. Cup number 1 would have been, I will take you out of captivity. Cup number 2 would have been, I will save you. And then God said, I will redeem you. That is cup number 3. And cup number 4 is, I will make of you a nation. And so they were celebrating with wine what God had told them. So they had 4 cups of wine. And probably a little bit more as they ate. So we know that these guys had been up from what time? About 5:45, 6 in the morning. They may have taken a nap in the afternoon, but they eat and they drink at this meal. At some point, we know Jesus turned and said, I have longed to eat this meal with you. But one who eats this meal with me is about to raise his heel against me, which is another way of saying, I'm about to be betrayed. Can you imagine the way the apostles felt? I mean, these guys didn't understand Jesus a lot of the time. You know, we may think that they understood everything that Jesus said. Not at all. As a matter of fact, we think they probably didn't understand most of what Jesus had said. And certainly tonight, he said, one of you is about to betray me. And they would have turned to each other and said, what the heck? You know, what's he talking about? We know each other. We've been together for 2.5 years. Who would do that? At some point, Peter would have motioned to John, Scripture tells us, and asked Jesus. John leans in, says, who is it? Jesus turns to him and says, it's the one who I give the bread after I have dipped it. So he would have taken the matzos and he would have dipped it in something called charoseth. It was another part of the meal. Charoseth was a pretty delicious little tasty thing that they had that night. It consisted of wine and nuts and cinnamon and dates and figs that were all smushed together. And so if you can imagine, it would have looked a lot like lumpy applesauce. It was brown. Brown, which is the same color as the mud that the slaves, the Israelites, used to make bricks out of mud and straw to build the buildings for Pharaoh. All of this was very symbolic. So what does Jesus do? He takes a piece of bread, hands it to Judas. You get to be Judas. You look like Judas. So here he is. And that's the way Judas must have, he was like, oh, cool. Because he must not know that I'm the betrayer. This is a sign of friendship, a sign of closeness. Then Jesus looks at him and says, do what you must do and do it quickly. So you're there that night. What would you have done when you saw Judas getting up and walking out of the room? You two would have jumped up and beat the bejeebers out of him. Except for the fact, what was Judas's job? He was the money keeper. So it was very common for Judas to get up and to go pay for something, to go give money for almsgiving. He may have simply gone down and made other arrangements with Mark's father. He might have given some coin to Mark's father, even for some of the food. He might have gone out and tried to get some more money. You see, Judas, as the money keeper, had to be a salesman. And for 2.5 years, who did he sell? He was selling Jesus. Have you ever watched televangelists on TV, you know? Now, I'm going to do this teasingly, but I'm going to use a Southern voice. You know, and if you send your dollars in, I promise that you will receive, blessings from God. Judas had to be a salesman. He had to sell Jesus to the people who were donating money. Except now he had a crisis of faith. He had a crisis of faith because he saw what was happening. Jesus had come into the city triumphantly on Palm Sunday. And there were probably hundreds of people that were carrying palm branches and saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Judas was smart. He saw what was going on. He saw Caiaphas, the members of the Sanhedrin, and knew that they didn't like what they saw. And then what else happened that week? Jesus went into the temple and he kicked over the money changers and those who were selling and buying in the temple. And he basically told them, "Get out, You've turned my Father's house into a den of thieves." The crucifixion was all about money. Why? Not just the money that Judas got, the 30 pieces of silver. It was the money that would not come into the temple if Jesus was very effective. Because suddenly he was pulling people away from the temple. He was kicking out the money changers. Caiaphas was the high priest that year. His father-in-law's name was Annas. He was the high priest before Caiaphas. The high priest controlled the money that came through the temple. Caiaphas looks at Jesus as a threat to his pocket. And he says, "We've got to get rid of this guy." How much money came into the temple? It was estimated by historians, the temple brought in money through a tax called the temple tax. It also brought in money from what they sold. They made a profit off from everything that was sold. They got a little bit of coin from everything that was sold. It's estimated at the time, of Jesus' time, it was $1.25 million. In today's money, it'd be about $125 million, controlled by Caiaphas. And now, Jesus may take that away if he's effective. So they go after him. Judas saw this coming. Judas was not dumb. So Judas goes off. And I said, why didn't they jump up and beat him up? Because Jesus probably did this. Guys, just stay seated. Let him go. And the rest of the apostles were probably oblivious because Judas would go off oftentimes. They didn't think anything of it. The rest of the meal wore on. We know that Scripture tells us that at some point Jesus took the matzos and he blessed it as is part of the custom, and he broke it and said, "Take this and eat it of it. This is my body." And later on, he took the chalice, the cup, and it would have looked much like this. Pretty simple, earthenware. The cup would have been filled with wine, and he said, "This is the chalice of my blood." We think it was the third cup, the cup of redemption. It was right toward the end of the meal. And Jesus said, "This is the cup, the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant. It will be shed for you and for all, so that sins will be forgiven." And then he said some words, "Do this in memory of me." And the apostles knew that night the Passover meal was changed forever. The old covenant between Moses, God and Moses and the people, the Israelites, is now changed. And there is a new covenant. The meal is drawing to a close. And at some point they celebrate the Hallel, one of the last parts. The Hallel is praise ye. You're going to be one of the apostles tonight. Oh boy, you hate this, I know. Stand up. So they danced. Come out onto the dance floor. Did I pick the right guy or what? Yeah. Okay. They would sing the Hallel, and they would clap, and they'd be singing. And they were happy because they had been drinking a lot of wine, and their bellies were full. And then they would dance around each other, almost like the hokey pokey. But they would. It was just a happy time. They were dancing. You were wonderful. Dancing with the Stars is in your future. It was a fun time as the meal ended. And they were all kind of relaxed. Because how close were they to Caiaphas' house? 300 feet. Only 300 feet away from Caiaphas' house, who hated Jesus, and some of them knew it. They were thinking, okay, we made it through the night. Now Jesus says, let's go to the Gethsemane. If you would, stand up for a second and just get the blood flowing in your bottom. And stretch. You can do the hokey pokey too if you want to, but just to stretch your muscles. So, here they are. They're at the upper room, the cenacle, and they're going to go. You can be seated now, thanks. They're going to go off to the Mount of Olives and to the Garden of Gethsemane. This was a favorite place of Jesus to stay, and they all knew it. They stayed there many times before when they would come to Jerusalem. They had to make their way then from the upper room back through the fountain gate or the water gate, and then they're going to come up the side of the city. The Garden of Gethsemane was about 1.5 miles away. And so that night they would have walked along the outside of the walls, of the eastern wall of Jerusalem. Now it's nighttime. We know what the sky looked like that night. What do we know about the sky? Full moon, yes. It was a full moon on the night of the Passover. So imagine this. This blue light, or white light, whatever, shining down on the white walls of the city. And here they are walking along a path that was probably twice the size of this aisle, of either of these aisles. Would have been right along the wall, and along the wall would have been braziers, lit braziers, that would have looked something like this. You guys remember Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom or something? That was just one of the movies that you would see braziers. So a stick wrapped in cloth, dipped in olive oil. There would have been a lot of olive oil around. They were going to the Gethsemane. This is raw olive oil. You'd probably cook with it and put it on your meat or whatever. These braziers would have been attached to the side of the walls of the city, and they would have occurred every 100 feet or so. So there were a lot of them. And again, there would have been people assigned to go and light these, and they would have burned a long time during the night, and they probably would have been replaced every day. So it would have been quite a sight. You would be in a lot of light underneath a brazier, and then you'd get a little bit darker. And there were a lot of people that were walking up and down. For some reason, I always thought, oh, yeah, Jesus and the apostles were walking along in nice quiet. No, there were hundreds of people, thousands of people that were walking. Because it was about midnight But there were still people that were coming and going from the temple. And how many people were in the hillside? 300,000 or a couple 100,000. And they had camps. And you could look up onto the hillside and see fires of the camps. And it must have been a beautiful sight. They walked along the brook Cedron in the Kidron Valley. The brook was probably something similar to Buttermilk Creek. You know Buttermilk Creek in Montague behind the post office? You know, they're working on it now, putting some stones and stuff. That's the amount of water that probably would have been flowing in that creek that night. So you could hear the gurgling as it fell over stones. Jesus walked along, and maybe when they came to a quiet place where there weren't many people, Jesus would stop and would give them instructions. He knew he was running out of time, and the instructions would have been, listen, you saw what I did tonight? I washed your feet. Now you have to do the same. This is my commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. What do we call that Thursday? Maundy Thursday. Well, why that word? It comes from the Latin word mandatum, a commandment. I command you. So Maundy Thursday is just another way of saying it. It's Commandment Thursday. Love one another as I have loved you. And then he'd walk along. And, you know, we just saw the NCAA basketball tournament a few weeks ago. And what would happen at a timeout? The players would all gather around the coach, and the coach would be drawing up, you know, here's what we're going to do next. And he'd be talking to them, and they were all clustered around him. That's what it was for Jesus that night. Jesus would be walking along, and then he'd stop, and they'd all gather around him, and he'd say, listen, you know, I told you, don't carry a sword or a walking stick or a bag or wear sandals on your feet. I'm telling you now, do that, because you're going to be traveling. And he'd walk along a little bit further. And then he'd stop and he'd turn to him and say, you know, if they hate you, that's okay, because they hated me first. And they'd walk along. And he was giving them little bits of information. He was cramming with them, just like you would on the evening before a test. You cram, at least I did. And maybe that's why I didn't get great grades, but nonetheless, that's what he was doing with these 11 apostles, because Judas was gone. They got to the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane is part of the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives was a rather large place on the side of the hill. It was also a burial ground. Historians said that there were as many as 120,000 graves that were on the hillside of the Mount of Olives. And yet that's where people would cluster and stay when they visited Jerusalem. The Garden of Gethsemane was 13,000 square feet. So what does that mean? What would that be comparable to? Well, Van Andel Arena in Grand Rapids is 162,000 square feet. So obviously a lot smaller than Van Andel Arena. The Viking Athletic Center is 40,000 square feet. So the Garden of Gethsemane was not as big as the Viking Athletic Center. Fricano's Banquet Center is 10,000 square feet. So a little bit like that. If you can imagine, take the VAC and divide it in thirds, it would be about a third of the size of the VAC. It was a Gethsemane. What is a Gethsemane? It's an olive press. It's actually get shemamen is the Hebrew words for an olive press. And there would have been many different kinds of olive presses, but basically two. One that sort of looked like a chair, and they would bring bags of olives and set it on the flat part, and then they'd put these huge stones on top of them, and it would start to squish the olives. And then they'd take another huge stone and put it on top of that, and it would squish it more. And they would collect the olive oil in basins at the bottom, and then put it in cisterns to let the sediment fall to the bottom. There was another Gethsemane, and that was a turntable that was driven by donkeys. And it would squeeze, you'd put bags of olives in, and this press, the donkeys would turn the press and squeeze. Sort of symbolic, because that night, if you can imagine it, Jesus was squeezed. They get to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there were a lot of little caves there. As a matter of fact, the Gethsemane, the olive presses, probably would be in caves. So they would go there to sleep. The apostles sat down. They had been awake for a long time. They had been eating, and they had been drinking, and they had been walking. So it was 1.5 miles back to the Garden of Gethsemane. They had walked at least 3 miles into town, but they had done a lot of other walking that night. Then comes the fact that Jesus says, you know what? The three of you, Peter, James, John, come with me to pray. And he walks off. We don't really know how far, but probably 30 or 40 feet, and begins to pray alongside of a rock. The three apostles fell asleep, just as the others did. Jesus prays. I want you to imagine the way it looked that night. The moon is on his face. He's looking up, praying to his Father. And as he looks up, he begins to sweat, because he realizes what's about to happen. And then his hair begins to mat along his face. The moon is throwing shadows from the olive trees around him, and that's showing up on his face as well. And he becomes frantic. As a man, he knows what's going to happen to him. And so he's terrified. And he prays, Father, let this cup pass away from me. And we know then that he said, not my will, but yours be done. Scripture tells us in the Gospel of Luke that his sweat was like drops of blood. There's a medical term for this called hematidrosis, where people who are under such pressure, their heart rate increases, their blood pressure increases, their muscles tighten, and the capillaries near the surface of the skin begin to break. And the only place that blood, that little amount of blood, can escape through it would be the sweat glands, the sweat pores rather. And so quite possibly his blood, his sweat did look like blood. This didn't happen to just Jesus. Other people have experienced hematidrosis. People in World War I and World War II, it's documented as they waited for the bombs to fall. They could hear them waiting for them to die. I'm sure it's going on in the Ukraine right now. Hematidrosis. You sweat blood. We think Jesus probably prayed an hour or more, but it's now about 2 a.m. They had walked again from the cenacle after finishing the meal about 11 o'clock. They had walked up, and Jesus had gone off and prayed by himself. And he turns to his apostles. He sees what's coming. Why? The Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane is about 80 feet higher than the walls of the temple. So Jesus can look down and see the temple guards and the Roman soldiers coming. Let's backtrack just a bit. Judas goes to see Caiaphas and says, I've got Jesus. I'm going to deliver him for you. Caiaphas is all excited. He says, good, I'll get some temple guards and we'll go and we'll arrest him. But first, Caiaphas decides, I'm going to go to Pilate and get some Roman soldiers for a couple of reasons. One is he wanted Pilate on his side. But another reason is because there were 300,000 people on the hillside. And a lot of them, as many as 5,000, believed that Jesus could be the Messiah. And if they saw him arrested, they might try and come to his rescue. So they better have a pretty good band of soldiers to go and arrest this guy. So where do they go to first, the soldiers? They go back to the cenacle. They think that Jesus is still there. And they raid the house of Mark's father. And they find Jesus isn't there. Judas says, listen, I know where they are. He always goes up to the Garden of Gethsemane. So here they walk up. Jesus sees them coming. The soldiers would have gotten there and asked the question, so who are you looking for? Jesus would have said, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, yeah, that's me. And the soldiers were like, holy mackerel, we've heard about this guy. He's performed miracles. There's a lot of talk in town about what he's done. So they were a little afraid of him. But we know that Judas would have come up and kissed Jesus. You want to be Jesus? Come on up here. I'm Judas. Pucker up. Jesus would have done this, or rather Judas would have done this. He would have come and kissed him on the cheek. Is that strange? No. In that culture, it was common. It was a sign of friendship or love, of respect. And even in European culture today, we may see on somewhat more rare occasions two premiers or two presidents who come up and they hug each other and they give each other a kiss on the cheek. So it was not unusual. Jesus looks at Judas and says, Judas, do you betray me with a kiss? And then things begin to happen. I'm going to need some Roman soldiers. Guys, let's have 4 or 5 of you come forward. Jesus, I'm going to need you too. Little did you know. Yeah. Okay. Are you able to get up and down on your knees? Or okay. All right. Good. What would have happened first? I need one more. At least one more. Want to join us? They would have formed a box around Jesus. The Romans had a very particular way of arresting someone. They would have clustered in a box, and the temple guards probably would have been on the outside of them. Then the lead Roman soldier, who would have been either a tribune or it may have actually been the centurion, which is a higher ranking, would have come up and he would have done this. Bam! Up into the chin and the nose, especially the nose. Why? Because they wanted to break the cartilage in the nose. What happens? The nose begins to swell. You can't breathe. Blood begins to drip from that. He can't breathe. They would have then immediately put a loose noose around him. It might have been a little bit thicker than this, but this will work for us. It would have been flexible, not a really big piece of rope, but a noose that would have gone around his head, his neck, and then get ready. Why don't you step aside for a second so they can see this. They would have driven his arm up in between his shoulder blades. I won't do that to you because it's very painful. But this is what would have happened. He would have bent over in pain. They would have tied one hand up and then tied the other hand up. And there you go, nice and tight. Why? Because now he can't use his hands. And if he tries to use his hands, try and use your hands, this tightens and he begins choking himself. Okay, so they have gone like this into the nose. The centurion then would have taken his foot and come down on the instep of the prisoner, bam, to try and break a bone in his foot. Or if not break a bone, to bruise the foot so significantly that now if by chance there was a scuffle and somebody tried to rescue him and he tried to run away, he's now breathing through his mouth, his foot is bruised, and every time he tries to use his hands, he ends up choking himself. So you can imagine trying to run away looking like this. The Romans were very cruel. Again, they would have formed a box around him, and then the soldiers would have begun hitting him freely. So, yep. Go ahead. Yeah. The Roman soldiers were taught to inflict as much pain as possible before they moved him away. But then during the trip back to Fortress Antonia, so here's this temple. The temple is 1,600 feet by 970 feet, so it's a big building. And in the northern part of the temple is where Pilate was staying in something called the Fortress Antonia. It's where he stayed, especially during these high holy days. Sometimes he'd actually stay at Herod's palace, but Herod was in town. So he was staying at the Fortress Antonia. So here they are up in the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. They're going to make their way down to the Fortress Antonia. It's not that far. It's about half a mile. And at that point, the Roman soldiers probably left and the temple guards took over. But all the way for that half mile, they were kicking him and hitting him, pushing him forward, maybe even throwing him down, and helping him up, and then doing this. All of them would spit on him. So by the time Jesus got to the Fortress Antonia, half a mile, he was pretty beat up. And then the temple guards, now you guys are temple guards, you continue walking with him, probably on the outside of the city, because they didn't really want to go through the city because there were a lot of people there. They would have gone along the outside of the city back to the house of Caiaphas. How far was that? About a mile. So Jesus did a lot of walking that night. They get to the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas, the high priest, takes a look at him and says, okay, we got this guy. It's about 3 a.m, possibly 3:30. This is okay. This is what has to happen. We have to call the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a group of 71 men comprised of Pharisees and Sadducees and ancients, older people, very powerful men. They were the judges of Jerusalem. And they would rule, they would hold court 6 days a week. They would take off the Sabbath, which was a Saturday. And they would work from 9 a.m. until 4 p.m, hearing cases. They had some rules of their own. One of those rules was that you could not hear a capital case for capital crimes at night, except they did with Jesus. They called these 71 men together. You had to have at least 23 in order to hear a capital crime, to have a court for a capital crime. But they called these guys out of bed, literally, and they brought them in. So imagine it may have looked a lot like this, and say the 71 of you are all part of the Sanhedrin. And here's Caiaphas saying, okay, they did not interview Jesus. They brought other people forward to interview. Just people off the street, we think. And they would ask questions, what did you see? Where were you? Very specific kinds of questions. And it's funny because all of the witnesses begin to tell different stories. And Caiaphas was getting frustrated. So Caiaphas then asked Jesus himself. Capital crime was not supposed to occur at night, but it was still nighttime. He says to Jesus, so, are you the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. Caiaphas rips his clothes open and yells out, Gedufa, which is Hebrew for blasphemy. He says, we have no further need of witnesses. This man should die. He's committed blasphemy, a capital crime. Funny thing is, the Jews couldn't put him to death. They had to go through Pilate. The other rule that they broke that night was you could not hold a capital crime court on the eve of the Sabbath. Why? Because if somebody was convicted of a crime, a capital crime, then they would spend the night in jail, or they didn't have jails, but they would spend the night in captivity, and then the next day they would be sentenced. You couldn't do that if you were meeting on a Friday, because the next day would have been the Sabbath, and they didn't meet on the Sabbath. But on this day they did. They said, we're gonna send him off to Pilate. And so they went with Jesus to Pilate. So come on over, let's gather in the center here. Now I'm Pilate. So, I understand that you claimed that you were God.
Yes.
Actually, Jesus would have just stood there. Pilate had heard about Jesus. Pilate knew that Jesus preached peace. So he goes, you know what? After speaking to him and not getting a very good answer, Pilate decides that he's going to let Jesus go. There's no proof that he's done anything wrong. So he sits on what's called the curial chair. The curial chair is the chair from which decisions are made. Once a decision is made from the curial chair, that decision is final. Pilate sits in his chair and says, he's innocent, let him go. Caiaphas and the other members of the Sanhedrin who are in the crowd down below hear this. Pilate says, thank you. I find no guilt in this man. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute, we're not going to allow that to happen. So they end up, is this working? Okay. So they end up going and saying, listen, he's been a troublemaker ever since he was in Galilee. And Pilate hears that and he says, Galilee, he's Herod's case. Even though Pilate has made a decision about Jesus, he now says, you're a Galilean, I'm going to send you to Herod. So they take him to Herod's palace. Where is Herod's palace? Really close to Caiaphas' house. They go back another mile. All the way, guess what happens to Jesus? Bam, bam, bam. Kicking, spitting, pushing him. He's exhausted. He hasn't slept now since 5:45 the previous morning, we think. He may have taken a nap in the afternoon, but we're not sure. He's very tired. He's exhausted. They get back to Herod's palace, and Herod takes a look at him and says, so you are the Christ. So I hear that you do all kinds of miracles. Why don't you change these rocks into bread? Change this water into wine. And Jesus does this, nothing. And Herod's ticked. He says, wait a minute, I've heard all about you. Now, perform. I've got a lot of guests in the crowd. Perform. Jesus does nothing. He says, so he's a king? Let's make him a king. Guys, if you would, throw the robe around him. Let's make him a king. Let's give him a scepter. Now take him back to Pilate. Where's Pilate? A mile away. What happens to Jesus? Boom, 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 all the way. They get back to Pilate. Pilate looks at him and says, whoa, he's back already? Oh my goodness. Herod found no guilt in him either. I found no guilt in him. Herod sent him back to me. Herod and Pilate hated each other until that night. What had happened is Pilate had decided when he became procurator about 7 years prior that he was going to build an aqueduct from Bethlehem, which was 6 miles south of Jerusalem. And he was going to take the temple treasury to build it. And he was going to have workers, Israelites, help to build this aqueduct. They didn't want it, they didn't need it. A lot of people protested. There was a group of what Pilate thought were protesters who came into the courtyard. Pilate had them killed. Turns out they were just Galileans visiting Jerusalem. So Herod was ticked. They had been at each other's throats ever since, until this night. So here he is, Pilate again has him. I find no guilt in this man. And the crowd is yelling and saying, you've got to do something. Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate says, hey, I can release him. During the Passover, I usually release to you one prisoner. Would you like Jesus? Or this other guy, Barabbas, who was a rebel rouser and had killed a lot of people. And they said, give us Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. He says, he's ticked. He says, listen, I'll have him scourged. Scourging was called half death or intermediate death. And they would take him to the Lithostrotos. The Lithostrotos was a courtyard in Fortress Antonia. It was made of cobblestone, and it had buildings surrounding it, so it was sort of a square. It had 3 or 4 stone columns in it. Archaeologists have uncovered those stone columns and have found that the stone columns had metal rings attached on either side. So let's use Jesus. I'm going to stand here. Okay, guys, you have to take his clothes off now. Maybe not.
Sorry for
you're right. You can take this off as well. We're going to do this. But they would have stripped him, and they would have tied his hands to these stone columns that were 3 or 4 feet high. His hands would have been tied to those iron rings, and he would have been in this position, bent over. And now one of you gets to be a lictor. A lictor takes the flagellum that would have looked like this. It would have been 12 to 18 inches of a piece of wood wrapped in leather, with leather pieces dangling from the end of it. And at the end of each of these pieces would have been bits of stone or bone or glass, shards of pottery. You want to do this? So here you go. If you would, run way back and give him a lot of whips if you would. Be my guest. Yeah, you might want to get out of the way. Oh, come on. Yeah, yes. So what happens as the whip hits him, and very good, it would hit him in the neck, it would hit him in the groin area. The whip would actually whip around and tear into the flesh in his legs, in his chest, certainly on his back. The Jews used whipping or scourging, but they would only administer, according to the law, and that was 40 lashes, no more than 40 lashes. The Romans didn't have any kind of number. So this would have continued time after time, keep going. Oh, really, just come on, hard, yeah. What would have started to happen is the skin, as these little bits would have dug in, and he would have taken a really running start and come down hard on him. These bits of stone or shards of glass or metal would have tore into the flesh and began leaving streaks in which he began to bleed profusely. And the streaks would have been here too. It would have ripped his flesh open, and there would have been just chunks of flesh. And then what they did also would be, after they had completed this, they would only complete it until the guy collapsed. So, collapse for us. The centurion would have come over, or the lictor would have come over, taken his hair, pulled back, and looked into his eyes. And if his eyes had rolled back and you saw the whites of the eyes, you knew that he was in shock. And that's when they would end. They would whip until he was in shock. He's now passed out. He's literally passed out. And then they would do something. They would take salt and do this. Why? It burned. Remember that the Romans would do anything to cause pain. You know what it feels like when you get a paper cut? And it's like, whoa! Can you imagine what it felt like to have salt poured on these open wounds? Jesus literally would have been shaking uncontrollably. And then they did this. They untied his hands, and he fell to the ground. On the pavement of the Lithostrotos would have been bowls similar to this, probably made of clay, and it would have been filled with water, because what they did is they had these near the entrances to the buildings around the Lithostrotos, where they would wash their feet before they went in. They just dipped their feet in. As I said, they did that regularly. Only this time, the soldiers would have done this. Pour that dirty foot water onto the prisoner. The other thing that they did that was there would have been buckets that might have looked like this. They would have had a cover on those buckets. And those buckets would have been maybe only a couple of them in the Lithostrotos, but they would have been for urinating. And then they would put the cover on it to keep the flies out. But what the Romans did is they took the cover off and they did that. It was just more liquid to wake the prisoner up. Why did they want the prisoner awake? To feel the pain. So now the prisoner is awake, and guys, help him up. Nicely. Nicely. The soldiers would have been having a fun day themselves. And one of them would have said, hey, he's a king. Let's give him a crown of thorns. And they would have put the robe back on him too. You want to put the crown of thorns on? The crown of thorns wouldn't have looked quite like the crown that we often see pictures of. It would have been more of what's called a capitata. It would have covered his entire head. It's probably not going to stay on because, oh, there we go. You want to turn slightly to the crowd. Yeah. They would have pushed that down. These are thorns that actually come from the hawthorn tree. They're about 1 inch to 2 inches long, and they would have pushed it down. They would have thrown a cloth over it, pushed it down into his head, and you would have seen rivulets of blood running down. He was losing a lot of body fluid. He began to go into what we call hypovolemic shock. His organs may begin to actually shut down. They bring him out to Pilate. Pilate stands him before the crowd and says, "Ecce homo," Latin for "behold the man." And he wouldn't have looked like a man at all. His eyes would have been puffy, his cheeks would have been puffy, he would have been purple and red. There would have been blood all over the place. His hair would have been matted. There would have been streaks of blood. His front would have been covered with blood. His back would have been covered with blood. They didn't even recognize him, those who were in the crowd. And they said, "Crucify him. Crucify him." And Pilate doesn't want to. What Pilate hears from the crowd is, if you don't crucify him, you are no friend of Caesar. He calls himself a king. That's in direct violation. He's against Caesar if he's a king. Wait till we get the word back to Caesar that you let this king go. A rival to Caesar. Pilate begins to think, holy mackerel. I'm boxed in. I don't know what to do. I don't want to kill this guy, but there's not much I can do. So what does he do? He calls for a pitcher of water and a bowl, and he washes his hands. That symbolic action actually came out of the book of Jeremiah, and it was used in cases throughout the Israelites' history, and it was used when a calf or a cow that was owned by a family would be killed accidentally, and the guy, instead of paying them for the cow, he would have washed his hands of the crime. So Pilate was doing the same thing. He was washing his hands of the crime. He says, all right, take him yourself and crucify him. Pilate had the power to let him go or to crucify him, and it's called ius gladii. And only Pilate had that power. So now they give him, yes, what's called the currifragium. The currifragium was about 6 feet high. Hold it up for us. Yeah, thank you. It would have been about 6 inches by about 3 inches and would have weighed anywhere from 30 to 60 pounds depending on how green the wood was. It may have been used several times, and it had, we're going to turn it over this way, in the middle a hewn portion, and this actually would have gone all the way through the wood, because that's where it would sit on the tree called the stipes crucis. The tree was probably made of olive wood, and it was already planted on the hill outside of Jerusalem called Golgotha, which in Hebrew means skull place. The Latin form of it was Calvary, after the Latin word calva, which means bald head. And that's what it looked like. It was about 15 feet high, Golgotha, outside of the city of Jerusalem. This piece would have fit over the tree, and it would have formed a T. In this case, I'm going to take your crown off because it's probably going to fall off anyway. But you're going to get this. It's going to be placed over your shoulder. So guys, if you do that, and we're going to do it the other way. I'm glad that you did it this way because they wouldn't have done it that way. Why? Because how wide were the streets? I said maybe twice as wide as these aisles. And so if you were carrying a big log this way, there wouldn't have been any room for people on the side. So it would have gone over his shoulder. The short side would have been in front, like this, or like this. His hands would have been tied to it. Most of the wood would have been behind him. And the Roman soldiers would have formed a box around him. And the centurion would have gone in front. And they would have been carrying a titulus. If you can reach that sign back there. And it would have looked almost exactly like this. It would have been a piece of wood. And Pilate had said, this is what I want you to write on it. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And it was written in 3 languages. The first one was written in Latin. Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. Jesus of Nazareth. In in Latin, they did not use the letter J. They used the letter I. So Jesus was Jesus. Jesus Nazarenus of Nazareth, Rex, King Judeorum of the Jews. And then it was written in Greek, and then it was written in Hebrew. This would have been carried in front of the prisoner so that everyone could see what the crime was. The crime was that he says he's the King of the Jews. And they would have made their way. They would have made their way about 4/10 of a mile from the Fortress Antonia to Golgotha. Jesus had been walking a lot that night. We figure he probably walked, after he was arrested, he walked 7 miles. And during the 7 miles, he was beaten repeatedly. So now he begins the walk to Golgotha. And there probably were 2 others that walked behind him or ahead of him. But the Roman soldiers would have been around him. Why was most of the weight back here? That was because if this guy fell, the weight of the cross, this currifragium, would have fallen on him. As a matter of fact, we have some physicians who have looked at this, and they have concluded that the mortal wounds of Jesus probably came when he fell, because the weight of the cross and falling down on the stone pavement probably damaged the heart tissue. And it was just a matter of time before he died. But it was unseen. We guess that he might have fallen 3 times. And then they called someone to take the cross from him. Oh, here, Simon of Cyrene. Here we go. You look like a Simon there. A big guy, you know. And he takes the cross from Jesus and carries it the rest of the way. We think that Simon of Cyrene may have actually carried the cross probably farther than Jesus did that day, because Jesus was so weak. The Roman soldiers and the centurion saw how bad he was. He had lost so much body fluid. They get to Golgotha, and he can hardly stand. And he is literally shaking. And then they begin the crucifixion. Remove his clothes. We're going to strip him again. Typically, those who were crucified would be naked. But because this was Jerusalem, and because the Romans recognized the fact that the Israelites, the Jews, did not like a naked person in front of them, they gave him a loincloth. But here's what they did. Guys, if you could go up on stage now so that maybe people can see a little bit clearer. They would have used a mallet that would have looked pretty much exactly like this, had a very heavy head, and they would have used nails that were about 5 inches long. Archaeologists have actually found nails that were used in the crucifixion. Crucifixion was a horrible way to die. It was started by the Persians and then perfected a little bit by the Carthaginians, and the Romans really perfected it. As a matter of fact, the historian Seneca, there were a lot of historians who wrote about crucifixions. Pliny the Elder, Josephus, Seneca. Seneca he described a couple of things that he saw. One was men that were crucified upside down and impaled through the genitals. Then he describes someone who was crucified with his strangled child hanging from his neck. That's how bad the Romans were. So here we are. Jesus, if you would lay down. Simon, you're good. Thanks. We appreciate the hand. They would have put the curifragium under him and stretched out his hands. I'll give you these. Let's see, let's start with one. And go and you kneel on his forearm. This is the way the Romans did it. Had to kneel on his forearm because once they began pounding the nail in, the man oftentimes would have a lot of force and move his arm up and hit the soldiers right in the midsection. They would look for a spot, not in the hand, but in the wrist. And that spot is called Destats space or Thanar's furrow. Thank you. And you can find it yourself. It's right in the middle of your wrist, on the back part of your hand. And if you move your hand back and forth, you can find a little hole in there, surrounded by bones. There have been a lot of studies done about where the nails went into and all, and there are a lot of historians and medical doctors who have determined that this was a probable place. They would find this little space and then pound the nail in, if you would do that. And when they did that, yeah, give it some good whacks. And at that point, the pain was so incredible, the knees would come up to the chest. And he would be screaming. And when they did that, they cut the medial nerve, and this is what happened to the hand. It formed a claw, and it was frozen there. So when Jesus hung on the cross, he could not move his fingers. They were in a claw shape. And then they moved to the other side. And they looked for that Destos space, Thanar's furrow. They found the little hole. And the same thing, he screamed in pain. Okay, he's now secured. Some historians believe that they may have wrapped some rope around his hands because was there a tendency for the hands to rip out? Yes. There was a French doctor, his name is Pierre Barbet, who was given permission by the French government to take 100 cadavers of indigent people and to do a study. And what he did is he pounded nails into the center of the hand where most artists will show the nail going into. And at each time, all 100 hands ripped out. Could not support the weight of a body. So that's why it was most likely the wrist. So now lift him up. Yeah, you can.
Crossbow.
Yeah. Here you go. Good. All right. Now take this. Yes. You can hold on to those. Oh, yeah. That's good. Now that hole that's in the middle now fits on top of the steepest crucis, the tree that was planted. There were two sizes of trees. One was called the Crucis humilis, and one was called the Crucis sublimis. Humilis was 6 feet high. That's all the cross was. Sublimis was 12 feet high, and that was only used for really important people. So most of the people who were crucified on a cross that was about 6 feet high. Oftentimes, artists' depiction shows that it's a very high cross, and they'll show Golgotha as being a big mountain and all. Now, Golgotha was a 15-foot high rock formation, and the tree was about 6 feet high, so that you could actually look at him. Now,
where I'm at, right?
Yeah, just about where you're at. They would have taken his feet, and they would have used one nail, 1 foot on top of another, and they would have pounded one nail through both feet. They actually have uncovered several skeletons of men who were crucified. The latest one was from Gavello, Italy. Gavello, Italy, there was a man that was crucified. They found his bones, and the nail was still in his feet. So it was proof that the Romans did this, and this was further proof. There was another skeleton that was found in 1968 in a sepulcher, and it was named Johannanen. And that guy had his feet went on either side of the tree, and the nail went through the ankle on either side. Jesus' feet, we believe, one on top of another. And now the tree, this was raised up above the tree, and they would work it into place. I'm going to turn right around and face the people here.
Thanks. Get the guys here.
And so it would look like this. The titulus, oh, what do we do with the titulus? Can you hand me that? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. If I jumped down, I'd break a leg. So now a small part of the tree is shown that has gone completely through this because it's setting on it. And then the titulus would have sat on that, been nailed to that part of the tree, and so it truly would have looked like a cross, but more like the letter tau, or a capital T. So here we have Jesus hanging for 3 hours. Sometimes the Romans would put a peg on the tree called the sedile. Would have looked like the end of this. It would have gone between the man's legs, so that when the man pushed up to grab a breath, and then the pain so intense he would have collapsed, the sedile would have caught in the crotch. It would have supported his weight. Okay, you guys are done. Thank you. So imagine these guys who are crucified. There are 3 of them. They're hanging there for about 3 hours. The thing about crucifixions, which made it so incredibly painful, is this. After you have your arms raised, and remember, Jesus has lost a lot of body fluid. He is in hypovolemic shock. You can breathe in. The muscles tighten, you can't breathe out. And you're panicking. So what do? His knees would have been bent when he was crucified, when they nailed his feet in, so that he could do this. Push up on that one nail so that he could grab some breath. We believe when Jesus would do that, he did it at least 7 times because that's when he would speak. The pain would have been incredible. I thirst. They would have given him pasca, a cheap wine, on a hysso, a sponge, and brought it up to his lips, and he would have turned his head away. Mother, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. You'll be with me this day in paradise. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It's finished. At that point, his bowels gave way. The smell would have been horrendous. He would have been drained of body fluids. The Roman soldiers were told it's almost the Sabbath. Sundown begins the Sabbath. It's now 3 p.m. We have to get rid of these guys. So they took what's called a patabulum. It was a bar used to actually bar doors. And they would come up to the other 2 who were still alive, and they would break their legs. Why? So they couldn't do this. And most likely, Jesus died of a combination of hypovolemic shock. The body fluids were gone. The organs shut down. It could have been his heart failed because we think his heart was damaged. It could have been he died of asphyxiation. He literally drowned in what body fluids he had left, because the body fluids would have gathered in his lungs. He could not push them out. His lungs would have filled with fluid. The pericardium around the heart, the sac that the heart sits in, would have filled up with fluid. And it would have been a clear fluid, so that when it came time to break Jesus' legs, they saw that he was already dead. So historians and doctors, physicians believe that the sword went up under the ribs because the soldier was pretty close. He didn't have to go up high. He just went up like this, under the ribs. And what happened, outflowed blood and water. The water was actually the fluid surrounding the heart that came from the pericardium. He popped it like a balloon. You have to think of what the heart must have done in those last hours. The heart that's beating like this now sits in a balloon filled with water, the pericardium, and it can't beat like it normally does. And then he probably clipped the lower chamber of the heart, because the blood flows to the lowest part of the heart or the body when a person dies. They would have taken his body down, and they would have cleaned it up there as much as they could have. Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, who was a secret follower of Jesus, along with Nicodemus. Joseph of Arimathea had a sepulcher, a grave hewn out of the rock about 125 feet away. So think of 125 feet. And they carried his body. They would have wrapped it in this white cloth. As best they could, they were running out of time. They would have carried his body, laid it on a white cloth, wrapped it around his feet. They would have put perfume and ointment and scents under his armpits, in his eye sockets, in his mouth, in his ears, in his anus, in his navel. All those areas that most likely would have deteriorated the quickest. And they did that so there wouldn't be quite the smell. And they could come back and see him again. They would have wrapped him in this white cloth. It would have come up, covered his face. They would have tied it at the neck. They would have tied his hands in front of him. They would have tied his ankles together so that when he laid on the shelf in the sepulcher, his hands wouldn't have done this, just by force of nature. Then they would have left part of this so that tied around the neck, but they would have allowed them to look at the face when they wanted to. They put the cloth over him, but before they did, they followed a Jewish tradition. They would have taken a feather, probably smaller than this, but it's a good visual. They would have placed it under the nose of the dead person and left it there for 15 minutes. If the feather had not moved, it proves that the soul had left the body and they could leave him in the tomb. They would have covered his face. The tomb would have been about 15 feet deep. It would have had some ledges. The body would have laid on one of those ledges. The Jews realized that they were running out of cemetery space. So what they would do, 7 years after the body was buried, they would go and they would take what was now the skeleton, and they would take the bones and put it into an ossuary, a small box, and set it in the same tomb, but it left more space for another body to be used. And they would do this repeatedly. So here they are in this tomb. There were tapers on the wall. John would have extinguished the tapers. They would have crawled out. I say crawled out because the opening of those tombs would have been about 4 feet high. And they would have rolled a stone, as we know from Scripture, in front of it. The stone is called a pillow, and it would have been rocked into place. It could be moved later or not. That might have been the end of the story. We know that Mary was hoping to come back after the Sabbath and do a better job of putting the spices and the perfumes and the ointments on him and getting the body ready. That's the story. We know what happened then on Easter morning, and that's the joyful part of this. The story is not pretty of Jesus the man and what he went through. I want to leave for you two thoughts as we end tonight. We see the crucifixion as a point in time. It happened 2,000 years ago. And my fear is we don't pay that much attention to it. Yeah, we hear the story every year. But what happened? I want you to think about this during this week as you prepare for Easter. What happened if it wasn't a single point in time? But using an Einstein theory, what if time could be frozen? And the crucifixion is actually happening now, still. We all have free will. We've been taught that. So that means that the decisions that you make could be affecting the pain that Jesus went through. That's an interesting theory, isn't it? The crucifixion is still happening, frozen in time. The choices that you make will affect whether Jesus suffers more or suffers less. That's a scary thought. The other thought I want to leave you with is this. We believe that Jesus died for our sins, died for each of us, the sins that we commit. And if that's the case, we know that he has a personal relationship with each of us. And in only the way that God can, he has a relationship with everyone throughout history. So, as he hung on the cross and pushed himself up for the last time, it's finished. Your face was on his mind. Happy Easter. Thanks for coming. Great. You're very patient. It's a long story. Thank you for your attendance and participation. All of you who were soldiers in Jesus, thank you. Simon, thank you. Great. Have a good evening.
That's the best, worst sermon I've ever heard.
Thanks. Thanks. It's hard for us to imagine the pain, and it's only if you tell the story like this.